This is Rawway State Prison, and I want you people to know at home TV that if you get up and go get a soda, a glass of beer, go to the bathroom, you might miss it.
James Scott was a champion who should have conquered the world, but instead, he conquered it from behind bars. Fighting out of Rawway State Prison in New Jersey, Scott became light heavyweight champion while serving a life sentence for murder. His story is one of the most tragic in boxing history. A brilliant fighter trapped by his own mistakes, watching opportunities slip away while locked in a cell. That frustration, that anger, that sense of injustice created enemies he could never truly settle scores with. Scott's hatred was different from other fighters. He couldn't chase his rivals outside the ring. He couldn't call press conferences or demand rematches in neutral venues.
You got a lot of people who do a lot of things and make a lot of mistakes. And we don't always bring up what you did in the past.
Every fight had to come to him, to that prison gym where he trained between head counts and lockdowns. The boxers who avoided him, the system that exploited him, the promoters who promised freedom and delivered nothing, they all became objects of pure rage that Scott could never fully express. Today, we're breaking down the 6 fighters and forces that James Scott despised most. These weren't just sporting rivals. They were symbols of everything that went wrong in his cursed career. From broken promises to ducked challenges, from exploited hope to stolen chances, these are the enemies that defined the prisoner champion's bitter journey. Let's begin. 6. Eddie Gregory. Eddie Gregory was the fighter who had everything James Scott wanted: freedom. When they met in 1978, Gregory wasn't just another opponent stepping into Rawway State Prison. He represented the outside world. The career Scott could have had if he hadn't thrown his life away. That made their fight deeply personal before a single punch was thrown. Gregory came in cocky, talking about how he'd exposed the so-called prison champion as nothing special. He told reporters that Scott only looked good because he fought in controlled environments against carefully selected opponents. Those words stung because there was truth in them. Scott couldn't prove himself on the big stages because he was trapped behind walls and barbed wire. The promotional setup made Scott's blood boil. Gregory got paid to travel to the prison, fought under special conditions, and then went home to his normal life afterward. Meanwhile, Scott returned to his cell regardless of the outcome. Win or lose, his reality never changed. That inequality poisoned everything about their matchup. During fight week, Gregory played mind games. He talked about the clubs he'd visit after the fight, the restaurants he'd eat at, the women he'd see. Every comment was designed to remind Scott of what he'd lost.
What you thought you could exploit his?
No doubt. When he threw his right jab, I was dipped to my left, hit it with a body shot, bring it to the head, bring it to my right.
The psychological warfare worked. Scott fought angry, almost reckless, desperate to hurt Gregory for flaunting his freedom. Scott won by decision, but the victory felt empty. Gregory walked out of that prison and went back to his life. Scott went back to his cell, still champion, still caged. That's what he hated most. Not Gregory himself, but what he represented. The reminder that talent meant nothing without freedom. 5. Alvaro Lopez. Alvaro Lopez wasn't supposed to be a serious threat, and that's exactly why James Scott grew to despise him. In 1979, Lopez was brought to Rawway Prison as what many considered a tune-up fight, someone for Scott to beat impressively before bigger opportunities. But Lopez didn't get the memo. He came to fight, came to win, and came dangerously close to embarrassing the champion on his own turf. The disrespect started during negotiations. Lopez's team demanded extra money, claiming the prison environment gave Scott an unfair advantage. They argued that fighting in front of inmates who worshipped Scott created intimidation that warranted additional compensation. Scott took that as an insult, suggesting his home court advantage mattered more than his skills. Lopez arrived at the prison acting like he was doing Scott a favor. He complained about everything: the ring, the lighting, the crowd noise, the dressing room facilities. His entitled attitude suggested he viewed this as beneath him, like fighting a caged animal for entertainment rather than facing a legitimate champion. That condescension ate at Scott's pride. When the fight began, Lopez proved tougher than expected. He frustrated Scott with movement and survived heavy shots that should have ended things early. The competitive nature of the bout made Scott look vulnerable, feeding into the narrative that his competition level was questionable. Whispers started that maybe the prison champion wasn't world-class after all. Scott eventually won, but the struggle damaged his reputation. Lopez went back to the free world claiming he'd been robbed, telling anyone who'd listen that Scott got hometown decisions. Those accusations followed Scott for years. He hated Lopez for making him look ordinary, for planting seeds of doubt that grew into widespread skepticism about his abilities. 4. Jerry Celestine. Jerry Celestine wasn't the most talented fighter James Scott ever faced, but he became one of the most infuriating. In 1980, Celestine arrived at Rahway Prison with a strategy that had nothing to do with boxing skill. He came to survive, stall, and steal rounds through pure negativity. His approach turned what should have been a showcase into an ugly, frustrating mess that made Scott look bad, even in victory. The disrespect started before the opening bell. Celestine openly admitted to reporters that his game plan was to avoid engagement, to make the fight boring, to frustrate Scott into mistakes. He wasn't there to win impressively, he was there to not lose badly. That cowardly approach insulted everything Scott believed about fighting. Championships should be won through courage, not through running away for 12 rounds. Celestine's tactics were maddening to watch and worse to fight against. Clinched at every opportunity and threw just enough punches to stay busy without ever taking real risks. When Scott pressed forward trying to create action, Celestine grabbed and held, turning the fight into a wrestling match. The referee seemed hesitant to penalize him aggressively, allowing the negative tactics to continue. The crowd at Rahway grew restless and angry. These inmates had come to see their champion destroy another challenger, to witness the violence and dominance that made Scott their hero. Instead, they watched Celestine turn it into a tedious chess match. Their disappointment reflected poorly on Scott, as if he couldn't impose his will on an obviously inferior opponent. 3. Marvin Johnson. Marvin Johnson represented the biggest threat to everything James Scott had built behind bars: legitimacy. Johnson was a two-time light heavyweight champion with credentials that dwarfed most fighters willing to enter Rahway Prison. When he agreed to challenge Scott in 1979, it should have been Scott's moment to prove himself against elite competition. Instead, it became a nightmare of politics and controversy. The hatred began with Johnson's demands. He wanted guarantees about judges, about the referee, about every detail of the fight's administration. His team publicly questioned whether a fair fight was possible in a prison controlled by Scott's supporters. Those accusations suggested Scott needed advantages to win, that his championship was illegitimate without environmental help. The insult cut deep. Johnson's camp played psychological warfare masterfully. They talked to the media about how uncomfortable the prison setting was, how the atmosphere was designed to intimidate rather than facilitate fair competition. They painted Scott as a manufactured champion, someone who'd never survive outside his protected bubble. The narrative shifted from respecting the prisoner champion to questioning his authenticity. The fight ended in controversy, a disputed decision that left both fighters claiming victory. Johnson's team immediately cried robbery, launching a media campaign that portrayed Scott as a fraud protected by corrupt judges. They demanded investigations, filed complaints, and spent months undermining Scott's legitimacy. The championship felt tainted afterward, the victory hollow, despite Scott's belief he'd won fairly. 2. Matthew Saad Muhammad. Matthew Saad Muhammad was the fight that never happened, and that absence haunted James Scott more than any defeat could have. In the early 1980s, Saad Muhammad held the WBC light heavyweight title, while Scott held the WBA version. A unification bout made perfect sense. It would have determined the undisputed champion and given Scott the platform to prove his greatness to a skeptical world. But Saad Muhammad wanted nothing to do with fighting in a prison. His team made that clear immediately, refusing to even consider Rahway as a venue. They argued that no legitimate championship fight should occur in a correctional facility. To Scott, Those were just excuses to avoid a dangerous opponent who couldn't chase them outside prison walls. The promotional gamesmanship drove Scott crazy. Saad Muhammad's handlers publicly expressed sympathy for Scott's situation, while privately ensuring the unification never materialized. They'd float the possibility in interviews, keeping fans interested, but always attached impossible conditions they knew authorities would never approve. What made the hatred burn hotter was watching Saad Muhammad defend his title against other opponents. Every time he stepped in the ring with someone else, it felt like a personal slight against Scott. He was choosing those fighters over the prisoner champion, validating the belief that Scott wasn't worth the hassle of special arrangements. The rejection stung worse than any punch. The media sided with Saad Muhammad. Writers argued that expecting a champion to fight in a prison was unreasonable, that Scott's incarceration shouldn't obligate others to accommodate him. Those opinions felt like the final betrayal, the boxing world acknowledging Scott's talent, but ultimately deciding his circumstances disqualified him from the biggest opportunities. He was good enough to be champion, but too inconvenient to be treated like one. 1. Bob Arum and Don King. The people James Scott hated most weren't fighters. They were the promoters who turned his suffering into profit. Bob Arum and Don King saw Scott as a novelty act, a sideshow attraction that could sell tickets based on curiosity rather than competitive merit. They dangled hope in front of a desperate man, promised opportunities that never materialized, and walked away rich while Scott remained imprisoned both literally and professionally. The exploitation was systematic and ruthless. Promoters marketed Scott's prison fights as spectacles, charging premium prices for the bizarre experience of watching a championship bout behind bars. They sold his tragedy as entertainment, packaging his pain for public consumption. Every promotional poster, every television spot, every press release reminded the world that Scott was a prisoner first and a fighter second. The cruelest aspect was the false promises. Financial exploitation compounded the personal betrayal. Scott earned fractions of what he would have made as a free champion. Promoters justified low purses by citing the costs of prison venues and limited revenue potential. Meanwhile, they pocketed massive profits from the novelty factor, from the media attention, from the unique story they could sell. Scott made them rich while earning poverty wages. James Scott's hatred was born from helplessness, from watching his potential die behind bars, while others profited from his pain. Hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments which rivalry hurt Scott the most. More boxing stories coming soon.